He slammed his fist on the polished conference table, so hard the glass trembled. "Are you deaf or just slow?" The billionaire barked, towering over the black maid he had been humiliating for the past 10 minutes. The room full of white executives stayed silent, pretending not to see the tears forming in her eyes. She kept her head down, whispering, "Sir, I was only trying to help." But before she could finish, her quiet daughter stepped forward. Aaliyah, soft-spoken, barely 13, always invisible in the hallways, and in a calm, steady voice, she spoke fluent Dutch. The entire room froze. The billionaire's mouth actually dropped open. For the first time since he walked in, he stopped shouting. Her words weren't loud, but every person in that room felt them land. "Mijn moeder vroeg alleen duidelijkheid, meneer." "My mother only asked for clarity, sir." The billionaire turned slowly, as if he wasn't sure he heard correctly. The executives exchanged confused looks, their expressions cracking from arrogance to disbelief. Not one of them, not his interpreter, not his international manager, understood the Dutch contract on the table. They had botched an 8-figure deal because of it. And yet this girl, wearing a hand-me-down hoodie and standing beside a maid's cart, had just spoken flawlessly. He stared at her as if she had rearranged the laws of the universe. "Oh, so you understand Dutch," he muttered, voice shaking at the edges. Aaliyah didn't flinch. "Better than the person you're paying," she replied, still in Dutch. A ripple of embarrassment swept across the room. One executive coughed. Another adjusted his tie. The translator looked like he wanted to disappear. But Aaliyah kept her eyes on the billionaire, steady and fearless in a way that didn't match her size. Her mother finally looked up, stunned, scared, hopeful all at once. The billionaire leaned in, trying to cover his shock with authority. "Say that again," he demanded. Aaliyah clasped her hands behind her back, straightened her shoulders, and repeated the line even more perfectly. Her voice was calm enough to cut through the air like glass. For the first time, the billionaire was no longer the strongest person in the room. A child was. If this already made your blood boil, tap like and subscribe so you don't miss stories where justice finally wins. Aaliyah had never been the kind of girl people noticed. At the Grand Sovereign Hotel, she moved like a shadow beside her mother, Keisha, pushing carts, folding towels, waiting quietly in corners while executives walked past them as if they were part of furniture. Keisha always told her, "Baby, stay quiet, stay small. Quiet people survive longer." But Aaliyah had never been small, just unseen. Every summer, every school break, she stayed with her mother in these halls, the place where Keisha scrubbed floors despite speaking 3 languages and holding a community college degree she was never allowed to use. When the rich guests left their messes behind, she cleaned them. When a manager barked orders inches from her face, she apologized. And when someone called her girl, she swallowed her pride and kept working. Aaliyah saw everything. She saw how Manager Cole always leaned on the counter, pretending not to hear her mother when she spoke. How Supervisor Brittany rolled her eyes every time Keisha offered a suggestion. How the staff snickered when Aaliyah brought books instead of phone, calling her Maid's little librarian when they passed in the hall. But Keisha always smiled at her daughter and said, "One day, your mind will take you farther than their money ever could." And she was right. While other children scrolled on TikTok, Aaliyah devoured language books she found in a used bookstore down the street. Dutch fascinated her. The way sentences fit together like puzzle pieces, the rhythm of it, the challenge. She practiced at night when Keisha slept, whispering phrases in the darkness so they wouldn't echo. By the time she turned 13, she could read Dutch business emails faster than most adults in the hotel. Not that anyone bothered to ask. And executives, they never suspected a thing. To them, she was just a maid's kid. Cole made sure of that. He had once said loudly, kids like her should focus on staying out of trouble, not pretending they're smart. Brittany laughed so hard she had to wipe her mascara. Aaliyah didn't flinch. She wrote the date down. She wrote everything down. Her little notebook was filled with moments no one else paid attention to. The day the translator confused deadline with termination. The morning Keisha warned about a Dutch cultural gesture being offensive. The weak executives ignored her mother's memo about a translation error that later cost the hotel a client. Every grunt, sigh, muttered these people from the staff watching her mother work, and still, Keisha held her head high. Still, she said, kindness first, justice later. But justice was already brewing. Quietly, precisely, in Aaliyah's mind. She just needed the right moment. A moment when the right person would underestimate the wrong girl. And when that billionaire screamed in her mother's face, when he tore the Dutch papers apart and blamed Keisha for his own incompetence, Aaliyah knew the moment had come. The breaking point didn't come suddenly. It built itself slowly, day after day, the way a storm gathers over quiet water. That morning, Manager Cole was already in a foul mood. A VIP suite had complained about a missing robe. And even though Keisha hadn't cleaned that floor in 2 days, he cornered her in the hallway with the fury of someone desperate to dump blame downward. Maybe if you people paid attention, he snapped, waving complaint slip an inch from her face, we wouldn't lose customers. Keisha kept her tone soft. Sir, I haven't been assigned that wing since. I don't want excuses, he cut in, looking her up and down with a sneer. You're lucky you even have this job. Aaliyah was stocking the cart beside her mother, her small hands methodically placing folded towels one over another. She didn't look up, didn't blink, didn't speak, but her pencil quietly moved across her notebook in her hoodie pocket, writing the time, date, and exact words. Cole wasn't done. He never was. And tell your kid, he pointed at Aaliyah without even glancing at her, to stand somewhere else. She's always watching people. It's creepy. Keisha stepped in front of her daughter protectively, but Cole brushed past both of them and barked at a passing staff member, see? This is why we need stricter hiring standards. Anyone off the street gets let in. Aaliyah wrote that down too. Downstairs, things were even worse. Supervisor Brittany was standing with 2 other workers, whispering loudly enough for everyone to hear. I swear, Keisha act like she's smarter than the rest of us, Brittany said. Why would a maid know anything about business? Unless she's teaching her kid how to scam people. Snickers followed. Aaliyah heard every word. So did Keisha. Her mother's hands tightened around the mop handle, but she said nothing. She never did. She tried to walk past, but Brittany took a step right into her path. You forgot to polish the brass on the 3rd floor. Again. Her tone was sugar-sweet, but the smirk behind it was sharp. I wasn't on brass duty today, Keisha answered quietly. Oh, how convenient, Brittany snapped. Maybe next time try doing your job instead of pretending you understand things above your pay grade. Aaliyah's jaw tightened. She wasn't writing now. She was watching. To anyone else, Brittany's tone was just rude. But Aaliyah saw the pattern. How Brittany always assigned double shifts to black cleaners, how she mocked their accents, how she checked their work twice as harshly as everyone else's. The problem wasn't the brass. It was the color of Keisha's skin. Later, when Keisha took out her lunch, a simple homemade meal, Brittany strutted by and sniffed dramatically. Whatever that is, it smells like poverty. That one hurt, even for someone used to swallowing hurt. Keisha quietly closed her lunchbox without taking a bite. Aaliyah put her hand on her mother's arm. Mom, you okay? Her mother forced a smile. I'm fine, baby. I'm used to it. But Aaliyah wasn't. That night, while her mother slept exhausted after another forced double shift, Aaliyah sat on the floor beside the bed, her Dutch textbook open and her notebook spread wide. She organized everything she had documented over the past year. Racist comments, unfair punishments, ignored memos, translation mistakes her mother caught, but no one listened to screenshots she quietly took on the public computers, audio clips she recorded without anyone ever noticing. She didn't know what she was building until that moment, but she knew why she was building it. The next morning came the billionaire, angry, rushing, desperate to salvage a failing Dutch contract, and the very people who mocked Keisha were the ones scrambling uselessly around him. Brittany bumped into Keisha intentionally and whispered, "Don't make us look bad today. Just stay out of the way." Then she looked at Aaliyah and muttered, "You too, kid." Aaliyah closed her notebook slowly, tucking it under her arm like a sealed weapon, because today wasn't just another day. Today, The people who mistreated her mother were about to learn what a maid's little librarian could really do. All it took was one moment, one insult too many, one billionaire screaming in Keisha's face. And Aaliyah, soft-spoken, invisible Aaliyah, finally stepped forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't step back. She didn't even blink. Aaliyah simply slid the Dutch contract across the table, tapped the section everyone else had misread, and said, still in flawless Dutch, "This clause doesn't cancel the agreement. It renews it." The billionaire froze. The translator's face drained of color. Brittany swallowed hard. Cole whispered, How does she know that?" But Aaliyah wasn't finished. Not even close. She flipped to the second page and pointed again. "And this part doesn't say the Rotterdam partners refuse negotiations," she continued calmly. "It says they're waiting for your corrections." The room erupted in whispers. The billionaire leaned in, eyes narrowing in disbelief. "Translate the next line," he ordered the interpreter. The man stuttered. I believe it says nothing like what he's about to make up." Aaliyah cut in smoothly. "Here's the correct translation." And she read the entire paragraph out loud, flawlessly, confidently, as if she had trained her whole life for this exact moment. It wasn't just her Dutch. It was the clarity, the precision, the authority. Everyone felt it. Even the billionaire, who had spent his entire life believing the world bent around his voice, was now listening to a 13-year-old girl, like she was the only adult in the room. Keisha stood frozen beside the cart, hand over her mouth, watching her daughter dismantle years of disrespect with nothing but brilliance. Cole whispered, "There's no way she translated that right." Aaliyah turned, switched to English, and recited the official Dutch legal description from memory, word for word. Perfect. The translator's shoulders slumped. He knew he was done. Everyone knew. The billionaire looked at him sharply. "Is she correct?" The man nodded weakly. Every word. Silence. Thick. Heavy. Embarrassing. A girl who wasn't even old enough to apply for a job had just single-handedly exposed the incompetence of half the executive team. Aaliyah took a slow breath and finally lifted her eyes to meet the billionaire's. "My mother tried to warn you," she said gently, "but nobody listens to people who clean your floors." Keisha wiped her eyes, stunned. Brittany stepped back as if physically pushed. Cole's jaw trembled, and the billionaire, for the first time in his life, had no idea what to say. Aaliyah opened her notebook, the same notebook Cole once mocked, the same notebook Brittany called pathetic. Inside were dates, notes, corrections, receipts, all in Dutch, English, and perfect handwriting. She laid it on the table like evidence in a courtroom. "You lost millions because everyone here thought my mother wasn't worth listening to." The billionaire exhaled shakily. "Show me," he said quietly. And Aaliyah did. She walked him through mistake after mistake. Errors as paid experts made, warnings as staff ignored, memos the supervisors pretended never existed. Every page was a mirror of truth. Every line exposed another failure. Every note proved the same thing. The maid's daughter saw what the executives couldn't. If you believe talent can silence every insult, share this video. And to everyone watching from the US, UK, and Canada, your voice matters. The billionaire wasn't leaning back anymore. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't even blinking. He sat forward, elbows on the table, eyes pinned to Aaliyah's notebook as she turned each page with a calmness that felt almost surgical. The executives who had mocked her mother stood in stiff silence, their confidence draining with every sentence she translated. Aaliyah pointed to a printed memo, one her mother had written months ago. "Here," she said softly. "My mother warned you this wording was incorrect." She even attached the corrected phrasing. No one replied. The billionaire's jaw tightened. "Who was responsible for that department?" he asked. Cole swallowed. Technically, I." Aaliyah didn't let him finish. She turned another page. Another ignored memo. Another correction Keisha made. Another email where Brittany replied, "Stay in your role." The billionaire leaned back slowly, a different kind of anger rising, one that wasn't directed at Keisha anymore. But Aaliyah wasn't done. She shifted to a pocket inside her notebook and slid out a folded sheet, a printout she had taken from a staff computer. "This," she said, "is the internal error report from your last Dutch negotiation." The translator mixed up 3 legal verbs. The billionaire scanned it, eyes narrowing. "Who signed off on this?" The translator looked at the floor. "I thought it was correct." Aaliyah turned to him, voice still soft. "You confused obscorten with be indigent. One means pause. The other means terminate." The man's face collapsed. Then Aaliyah reached into her backpack and pulled out something none of them expected. A USB drive. Cole stepped forward. "What is that?" "Proof," she said simply, "of everything you ignored." She plugged it into the conference room screen. A folder popped up labeled, "Hotel Evidence. Do not delete." Inside were recordings of Brittany's racist comments, screenshots of ignored warnings, timestamps showing forced double shifts, photos of memos torn up in the trash, audio clips of staff laughing at Keisha's accent, printer logs with Dutch drafts. Aaliyah corrected herself. Brittany's face turned ghost white. I never said anything racist." A clip played instantly. Her own voice filled the room. "Whatever that is, it smells like poverty." Silence slammed down. Brittany covered her mouth with trembling hands. Cole tried a different approach. "This is illegal. You can't just record people." Aaliyah looked up at him calmly. "Your employee handbook says recordings are allowed for safety concerns. And racism," she continued, "is a safety concern." The billionaire nodded slowly. "She's right." Cole froze. Then Aaliyah opened a final folder. This one held the document she had been saving, the one she hadn't shown anyone yet. Payroll anomalies, names of employees who didn't exist, salary deposits into accounts linked to the same 3 IP addresses. The billionaire stiffened. "What is this?" Aaliyah spoke gently. "Ghost workers. Fake staff being paid real money." He stared at the screen, horrified. Who authorized these entries?" Everyone looked at Cole, but Aaliyah shook her head. It wasn't him. The room turned. Brittany's voice cracked. "Hey, are you saying I?" "No," Aaliyah said. "It wasn't you either." She clicked one final file. A signature appeared. The hotel's international liaison officer. The billionaire whispered the name like a curse. Jason, his highest paid manager. His most trusted. His friend. Aaliyah nodded. "He forged approvals using your digital stamp. And he used racism to keep the people who could have caught him, like my mother, far away from anything important." The billionaire pressed both hands to his forehead. "How long has this been happening?" "For years," Aaliyah answered. "I started noticing when I was 9. I didn't know what it meant then, but I do now." The room felt like it had stopped breathing. A 13-year-old had just uncovered a fraud scheme no adult had seen. Keisha put a hand over her heart, tears spilling before she could stop them. "My baby," she whispered. The billionaire looked at Aaliyah with an expression that wasn't shock anymore. It was respect. Real respect. "What do you want me to do?" he asked quietly. Aaliyah closed her notebook slowly. "You already know what needs to happen." He did, and the wheels of justice, real justice, began to turn in that moment, faster than anyone in that room was prepared for. The next 48 hours moved faster than anyone expected. The billionaire didn't call a meeting. He didn't warn anyone. He didn't even let the hotel finish breakfast service. He went straight to the board. Within 3 hours, investigators were inside the Grand Sovereign Hotel, quietly collecting statements, emails, payroll logs, security archives, all the things Aaliyah had pointed them toward. By noon, the hotel hallways were pulsing with nervous whispers. Supervisors walked stiffly. Managers avoided eye contact. Staff stepped aside whenever Aaliyah or her mother passed, unsure whether to hide or apologize. And then the doors to the main lobby opened. 4 men in dark suits entered, badges flashing under the chandeliers. Federal investigators, not local police, not corporate auditors. Federal. Their arrival sucked the air out of the hotel. Cole tried to slip away toward the service elevator, but one of the agents blocked him with a barely raised hand. "Not you," the agent said. Stay where you are. Brittany clutched her clipboard, so tightly the edges bent. Keisha stood beside Aaliyah, shaking, unsure whether to breathe or pray. The billionaire guided the agents into the conference room, the same room where it screamed at Keisha not long ago, and motioned quietly for Aaliyah and her mother to follow. Cole's voice cracked. "Sir, maybe we should—" "You've said enough," the billionaire snapped without looking at him. The room filled with tension as the agents took their seats. Aaliyah sat down calmly. She placed her notebook on the table. One of the agents nodded at her, not in condescension, but in recognition. They already knew who she was. The billionaire cleared his throat. "This is the girl who brought the evidence," he said. The lead agent turned to her. "You compiled this yourself?" Aaliyah met his gaze. "Yes, sir." Cole scoffed under his breath. "She's a child, quiet," the billionaire barked. The agent opened a folder. Inside were printouts of Aaliyah's files, screenshots, and even the Dutch translation errors she cataloged. "This," he said, "is more organized than half the fraud cases we process." Brittany's mascara trembled under her eyes. I never meant any harm." Before she could finish, the agent pressed play on a recording. Her own voice spilled into the room again. "Whatever that is, it smells like poverty." And then another recording. "People like you wouldn't last a day in a real job." And then another. "Black staff always need to be watched twice." Brittany covered her face and began to cry. Not the tears of guilt, but the tears of consequences finally landing. Cole tried to stand. This is out of context, but Aaliyah hit a single button on the laptop. An entire reel of his comments played like a soundtrack of arrogance. "You people, stay in your lane. Maid work doesn't require brains." Each clip was a nail in his own coffin. The billionaire stared at him as if seeing him for the first time. "This is who you've been in my building?" Cole didn't answer. He couldn't. The agents weren't here for his insults, though. They were here for Jason, the international liaison officer. And right on cue, Jason burst into the room, already sweating, pretending he had no idea why investigators were inside the hotel. "What's going on? Why are—" He stopped when he saw Aaliyah's notebook open on the screen. Then he saw the payroll logs, the matching deposit codes, the repeated IP addresses, the forged approvals, the ghost employees. His face drained of color. The billionaire didn't raise his voice. He spoke with the cold finality of a man who had run out of mercy. "You stole from me," he said, "and you used racism as a shield to stay hidden." Jason stammered. "Sir, I can explain." "No," Aaliyah said softly. "You can't. I checked every file." The lead agent closed the folder. "Jason Thompson," he said, "you are under investigation for payroll fraud, identity fabrication, and embezzlement." Jason backed away, palms shaking. "This is insane. She's just a kid. She doesn't understand." Aaliyah looked at him, calm as ever. "I understand perfectly." The agent stepped forward. Jason tried to bolt, but two others grabbed him by the arms. The snap of the handcuffs echoed across the table. Cole took a step back. Brittany cried harder. The translator sank into a chair, face buried in his hands. The billionaire exhaled, letting years of misplaced trust drain out of him. He turned to Keisha. "You should never have been cleaning floors in this building," he said quietly. "Not with your skills. Not with your intelligence. And not after the way you've been treated." Keisha blinked, tears slipping but her posture straight. Then he turned to Aaliyah. "And you," he said, voice softening, "are the reason this entire place didn't collapse under the weight of its own corruption." Aaliyah didn't smile. She wasn't here for praise. She was here for justice. The billionaire placed a new contract on the table. Not the Dutch one, but a fresh one written in English. "Keisha," he said, "I would like to offer you the position of International Communication Assistant. Your languages are an asset, not something to ignore." Keisha covered her mouth in disbelief. She had dreamed of a job like this for years. "And for you, Aaliyah," he added, "I want to fund whatever education you choose. You've earned it." Aaliyah simply nodded, not out of arrogance, but out of knowing she had fought for her mother's dignity, and won. Outside the glass walls of the conference room, Staff watched as Jason was escorted out in handcuffs. Some whispered, some gasped, some simply stared. Justice had arrived loudly and quietly, because sometimes the loudest justice is delivered by the quietest genius. No one in the hotel spoke when Aaliyah and Keisha stepped out of the conference room. The same hallways where people once ignored them now felt different, quieter, softer, almost unsure. Workers who had looked past Keisha for years lowered their eyes in shame. Others glanced at Aaliyah with a kind of stunned respect, as if trying to understand how someone so small had carried something so powerful. Keisha walked slowly, one hand brushing the wall she'd scrubbed 1,000 times. Except today, she wasn't heading to the supply closet. Today, she was heading upstairs, to the office she had earned long ago. Aaliyah walked beside her mother, holding nothing but her notebook, her weapon, her archive, her truth. When they reached the elevator, Keisha finally spoke. "You didn't have to fight for me like that, baby." Aaliyah looked up at her. "Mom, you fought alone long enough." Keisha blinked hard, the words hitting deeper than anything said in that conference room. She pulled her daughter close, holding her tight, not because she was afraid, but because she had finally allowed herself to feel proud. Up on the 12th floor, workers were clearing out an office. Her new office. Keisha paused in the doorway, touching the polished desk, the clean glass, the chair no one ever thought she deserved. Aaliyah set her notebook down gently, like placing a crown where it belonged. "You can decorate it however you want," Aaliyah said softly. Keisha laughed, the kind of laugh that rises from relief, not humor. "I've never had a place that was mine," she whispered. "You do now." For a long moment, mother and daughter stood together, taking the room, breathing in a future that finally matched their worth. Downstairs, the world continued moving. Guests checking in, staff whispering, managers reshuffling responsibilities. But something had shifted permanently. Those who once mocked Keisha now second-guessed every word. Those who ignored Aaliyah now stepped out of her way. Justice had changed the building. Truth had changed the people. And Aaliyah, quiet, brilliant Aaliyah, had changed everything. That night, as they left the hotel through the front entrance instead of the service door, Keisha squeezed Aaliyah's hand. "You know," she said gently, "you didn't have to be the one to fix all of this." Aaliyah looked ahead, her voice soft but certain. "No, Mom, but someone had to see what everyone else refused to." They crossed the street as the sun dipped behind the skyline, the city glowing gold around them. Cars passed, people talked, life moved, yet the world felt fairer. Even if only by an inch, it was enough. Some victories roar, some victories echo, but the greatest ones, they walk quietly beside you, exactly like this moment. Aaliyah closed her eyes briefly, letting the air hit her face. Justice wasn't loud today. It didn't need to be. It had already been heard. If this happened in front of you, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you stand for fairness, hit subscribe.